The imperial reception hall of Vel Antha-Sora had a sound. Not music, not machinery, something older than either. A low resonant frequency produced by the movement of air through 3,000 years of architectural intention, so consistent and so ambient that it registered not as noise, but as the quality of the silence around it. Darian Cole had been briefed on many aspects of this posting. He had not been briefed on the sound. He stood in the hall's entrance corridor and spent approximately 4 seconds trying to identify it before his protocol coordinator murmured in his earpiece that they were 60 seconds from introduction, and that he should probably look at the room rather than the ceiling. He looked at the room. The Cathari imperial court was assembled in the formal geometry of a civilization that treated ceremony as precision engineering. Every position meaningful, every distance deliberate, every angle of posture calibrated to communicate something to someone who knew the grammar. Darian knew enough of the grammar to read general intent, and not enough to catch the fine print, which his briefing officer had described as the appropriate level of knowledge for a first-contact envoy. Enough to be respectful, not enough to be presumptuous. He had spent 3 weeks achieving this calibrated ignorance and was reasonably proud of it. The Empress was at the far end of the hall. He had seen images, of course. The Interstellar Commerce Assembly maintained a dossier on Vel Antha-Sora that was 400 pages long and had been updated 17 times in the past decade alone, because she was the kind of subject who generated data faster than analysts could categorize it. 312 years of rule, 47 formal treaties, 6 wars, all concluded on terms favorable to the Cathari. The images showed a woman who was tall by human standards, chromatic in the specific way of her species' skin that carried pigment-responsive cells across its surface, shifting through the visible spectrum in response to biochemistry, currently settled in the deep neutral silver of a person whose internal state was entirely under control. Her secondary eyes, the pair set slightly above and outward from the primary set, a characteristic Cathari feature, were the color of old amber. She moved through the hall's formal geometries with the ease of someone who had stopped being aware of the room, because the room had long since become an extension of her. She was more than the dossier. They always were, in person. The genetic screening was standard protocol. The Commerce Assembly had been informed of this well in advance, and Darian had submitted a preliminary biological profile that was supposed to streamline the process. The screening itself was brief. A small crystalline instrument passed near his wrist by an imperial physician, a 20-second analysis cycle, the data transmitted to the Empress's private terminal in a sequence that, according to his briefing, typically took 4 minutes to review and resulted in either formal introduction or formal dismissal. Darian stood in the screening antechamber and waited. He had been standing long enough to mentally compose 2 possible opening statements and partially draft a third when he heard a sound he couldn't identify. Not the hall's ambient resonance, something sharper, the kind of sound a room makes when something unexpected happens in it. The door opened. The protocol coordinator came through it with the specific expression of a very experienced person who had just encountered something outside their experience and was performing adequacy while they processed it. "The Empress," the coordinator said, "requires a brief recess before formal introduction. You'll be shown to guest quarters." Darian looked at him. "Is the screening complete?" "The screening is complete." "Did I pass?" The coordinator paused for precisely the length of time that told Darian everything and nothing. "Guest quarters have been prepared at the diplomatic tier," he said. "It's an honor designation." Darian nodded and let himself be guided through a corridor that was extremely well appointed and had, he noted with the professional attention of a diplomat who had been in enough complicated situations to read infrastructure, no external access points. He sat in the guest quarters. He opened his trade brief. He ate the meal the kitchen sent, which was thoughtfully calibrated for human dietary parameters and excellently prepared, and he read his brief with the focused concentration of a man who had decided that preparation was the only form of control currently available to him. He was on page 12 when he became certain, in the way you became certain about things before you had evidence for them, that this posting was not going to go the way any of his 31 predecessors had experienced it. Vel Antha-Sora ran the analysis 4 times. This was not, in itself, unusual. She ran genetic analyses multiple times as standard practice, because data was only as reliable as the methodology that produced it, and she had learned in her first century of rule that the most dangerous position was certainty based on a single source. What was unusual was the reason she ran it 4 times. The first analysis was for confirmation. The second was for error checking. The third was because she did not believe the second. The fourth was because she had dismissed the chief xenogeneticist from the room and needed the time it took the instrument to run to put her hands flat on the surface of the console and breathe. She had not needed to deliberately breathe for a very long time. The data on the terminal did not change. It was not the nature of data to change because you needed it to. She had always considered this one of data's most professionally useful qualities. She was finding it, at this particular moment, quite difficult to appreciate. The xenogeneticist's name was Vel Antha-Sora, and she had held her position for 30 years, which was long enough to have developed a professional relationship with the Empress built on mutual respect for precision, and a shared understanding that the correct response to extraordinary findings was methodological rigor rather than emotional reaction. She had returned to the room twice since being dismissed, once to confirm she hadn't misread the quantum marker sequencing, and once because she needed someone with more authority than herself to also know that she hadn't misread the quantum marker sequencing. The match coefficient, Vel said, from the doorway, because she had learned to deliver significant information from the doorway and wait to be invited further, is 97.4%. I read the coefficient, Vel Antha-Sora said. The remaining 2.6% is attributable to 2 centuries of genetic drift in an incompatible biological substrate. If you account for, I am aware of the drift calculation, Vel. It's an exact match, the xenogeneticist said quietly. Accounting for substrate divergence, it's an exact match. The Empress looked at the terminal. The terminal displayed, across its full width, the genomic architecture of a human envoy from a civilization that had been attempting diplomatic contact with the Cathori Empire for 60 years, and laid across it. In the comparison overlay she had pulled up on the third run of the analysis, the genetic signature of Vel Korin, her bondmate, retrieved from the Imperial Biological Archive, preserved in the way her civilization preserved its dead. Completely, precisely, and without mercy. The markers were identical, not similar, not related in the way distantly connected biological lineages were related. Identical in the specific way of quantum genetic encoding, the precise biological fingerprint that was unique to an individual of her species, and that had no business existing in the genome of a human whose civilization hadn't achieved deep space travel until 150 years ago. The consciousness transfer had been attempted at Vel Korin's death. She had been there. She had held the encoding instrument herself because she had not been willing to let anyone else be the last thing he felt. The xenogeneticists had told her afterward that the attempt had failed. The quantum structures had dissipated. The encoding hadn't held. The technology remained theoretical and was unlikely to advance to practical application within her lifetime. She had accepted this information with the composure that 3 centuries of rule had built in her, which meant she had accepted it in the room, and then spent 3 months in the private observatory in the company of the precise shape of his absence. She had spent the following 200 years learning to govern around a wound that did not heal, only organized itself more efficiently into the tissue of her days. She had been successful at this. She had been, by any measurable standard, extraordinarily successful at this. And now the quantum structures that had theoretically dissipated were displaying on her terminal in the genome of a human envoy who was, at this moment, reading a trade brief in the diplomatic guest quarters and probably wondering about the schedule. Where was he born? She said. The third moon of a system called Callaway's Run, Vel said. Human colonial settlement, established 110 years ago. And his parents? Standard human biological lineage. Nothing in his family history that intersects with Cathari genetic architecture. No recorded contact between his family line and the Empire in any generational record. The Empress looked at the comparison overlay on her terminal. She looked at the two genetic signatures running parallel to each other, mirror and mirror, impossibility and impossibility, and she understood something that 3 centuries of rule had not prepared her for. That the universe occasionally constructed situations not as cruelties and not as gifts but as questions, and that the only honest response to a question was to go and look at it. She told her senior minister that formal introduction had been rescheduled. She told her protocol coordinator to inform the human envoy that the Empress would be visiting his quarters informally, which caused the coordinator's expression to do something she was fairly certain it had never done in his 40 years of service. She walked through the corridor of the Imperial Residence wing alone, which she hadn't done in decades, and stood in front of the door of the diplomatic guest suite, and understood that whatever she found on the other side of it was going to be its own thing entirely, and that she needed to be capable of knowing the difference between a ghost and a person. She knocked, which she also had not done in decades. The door opened. Darian Cole stood in it, trade brief in hand, with the expression of a man who had been expecting something but had correctly identified that he didn't know what. He looked at her directly, without the reflexive lowering of gaze that most people managed in her presence without knowing they were doing it, and said, "Empress." "Envoy Cole," she said. "Is the recess over?" he said. "Not formally," she said. "I wanted to speak with you informally if you're willing." He considered this for exactly the amount of time it took a competent diplomat to assess an unprecedented situation and decide that the correct response to an empress asking informal permission was not to make her wait. "Of course," he said, and stepped back from the door. She walked into the room. She looked at him in the full light of the interior, which was different from the antechamber's screening light, and registered what she had registered in the screening antechamber before the data arrived and reset everything. He was unremarkable in the way of a person who had chosen not to perform, brown-haired and mid-height, and possessed of eyes that were paying considerably more attention than his expression let on. He looked nothing like Vel Corin. He looked like himself, entirely and specifically, which was the first coherent thought she'd had since the terminal. "Can I ask?" Darian said, setting the trade brief on the table and managing the question in the careful register of someone who knew they were entering territory without a map, what the genetic screening showed. She had not planned to tell him immediately. She had planned to conduct a conversation and assess the terrain before committing to disclosure. She looked at him in his guest quarters, eating his diplomatically calibrated meal and asking the right question in the right tone, and understood that the plan had been built before she was in the room with him, and that rooms had a way of changing plans. "Something I need to explain," she said. "That will take some time." "I have time," he said. "The trade schedule is apparently flexible." She sat in one of the room's formal chairs, which was not something she did in rooms that were not hers, and was aware that he noticed this without comment, filed it, registered its significance, moved past it. He was, she thought, quite good at his job. "Tell me what you know," she said, "about quantum genetic consciousness transfer." He thought about it honestly. Theoretically possible, practically unachieved, subject of ongoing xenobiological research by 6 major civilizations including the Cathari. Abandoned by the Cathari Imperial Science Division approximately 260 years ago. He paused. "It's in the dossier." "Do you know why it was abandoned?" "Failed attempt," he said, "following a significant loss." He said it without particular weight, because it was dossier language, historical language, the language of events that happened before the current occupant of the room was born. She registered the distance between his understanding of the phrase and her experience of what it described, which was the distance between reading about a wound and having one. Yes, she said, following a significant loss. He looked at her. His eyes were doing the thing she'd noticed, paying more attention than his expression admitted. Empress, he said carefully, does the screening result have something to do with the failed attempt? It has everything to do with it, she said. The room absorbed this. The Imperial Observatory's ambient sound, the deep resonance of Vel Antha-Sora moving through its orbital path, reached them even here, a vibration more felt than heard. Darian Cole sat down in the chair across from hers, not because he was casual about it, but because he was apparently experienced enough to know that some conversations required both parties to be at the same elevation, which was a diplomatic instinct she respected. "Tell me," he said simply. And then, after a beat, with the dry precision of a man who had been in enough impossible rooms to know that humor was sometimes the only structurally sound response. "I'm going to guess this is why the previous 31 envoys didn't make it past screening. They did not carry the markers," she said, "and I do." "You do?" He nodded slowly, in the manner of a person receiving information that restructures the architecture of the present moment, and then said, "I'm going to need you to explain what the markers mean." So she did. She told him about Vel Corin. She told him not in the formal language of the Imperial Archive, not in the dossier language of significant historical loss, but in the direct and unarchived language of a person describing someone they have not spoken about directly in 200 years, because the people around her have been too appropriately reverent of her composure to ask. She told him about the bond-mate system of her species, the neurological integration, the physiological completion, the specific quality of a bond-mate's absence that was unlike any other absence, because it left a precise negative space where a presence had been, exact and undiminishing. She told him about the transfer attempt. She told him about the 3 months in the observatory afterward. She told him about 2 centuries of rule through the efficient scar of it. She told him all of this and watched his face, which did not perform sympathy or construct appropriate diplomatic gravity, but simply received what she was saying with the focused, serious attention of someone who understood that some information required being genuinely present for. "And the markers in my genome," he said when she had finished, "match his." "Exactly," she said, "accounting for 2 centuries of substrate divergence." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched his face work through something that had no map, in the way of a person who was intelligent enough to understand the implications before he had processed the feeling of them. "I'm not him," he said, not defensively, clearly. "No," she agreed, "you are not. But something in my genome is saying otherwise. Something in your genome is carrying a signal that should not have survived," she said. The quantum structures were declared dissipated. The technology was abandoned. And yet, she looked at him, at this specific, unremarkable, entirely himself person in his diplomatic guest suite, and said the thing that was true. "Here you are." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "What do you need from me?" he said. She had expected many possible responses to the evening's information, organized by probability in the manner of a person who had spent 3 centuries preparing for consequences. She had not specifically prepared for that one. "I beg your pardon. You've had a significant piece of information for several hours," he said. "You processed it, you came to see it directly, which tells me something about how you operate, and now you're sitting across from me in guest quarters you're not required to be in. What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light of the room. Her chromatic skin, which had spent 3 centuries learning to hold its neutral silver regardless of internal state, did something she noticed in the way you notice things that happened without permission. It warmed, fractionally, in the register her species used for a word that translated approximately as recognition. "I don't know yet," she said, which was, in 312 years of rule, possibly the most honest answer she had given anyone. That's a reasonable place to start, he said. Vel Korath delivered her final report the following morning, in the Empress's private receiving room, with the comprehensive thoroughness of a scientist who had spent the night doing the most important work of her career, and was aware of it in every line of her methodology. The quantum genetic markers were not a coincidence, a contamination error, or a sampling anomaly. They were the encoded consciousness fragments of Vel Koran, distributed at the moment of failed transfer into quantum substrate that had, over 217 years, across a distance of 43 light-years, through the specific and unrepeatable physics of quantum decoherence and recoherence in compatible biological architecture, reconstituted in the developing genome of a human child on the third moon of a colonial settlement that had no knowledge of the Cathori Empire, of bondmates, of consciousness transfer, or of the fact that a signal that should have dissipated had instead spent 2 centuries finding its way home by the most improbable route available. Not a reincarnation. The report was specific about this, with the precision of a scientist who had anticipated the misinterpretation and preemptively addressed it. Not a continuation of consciousness, not a transmigration of identity. A signal in a substrate, information encoded in biology, carried without the carrier's knowledge, present without being paramount. Vel Koran was not Darian Cole. Darian Cole was not Vel Koran. But Darian Cole carried, in the quantum architecture of his genome, fragments that had once been part of a consciousness that the Empress had held and lost, and those fragments had found their way into compatible biological housing, and persisted in the way that encoded information persisted when it had nowhere else to go. Darian received this report sitting across from Vel in the Xenogenetics review chamber, because the Empress had determined that he was entitled to the scientific findings about his own genome, and that receiving them from the source was preferable to receiving a summary. He read through it twice with the focused attention he gave to complicated documents, and then he set it on the table and said, "What does this mean for me biologically?" "Nothing active," Vel said. "The markers are present but dormant. There's no physiological effect on your own biology. You're not altered by their presence. Just carrying them. Just carrying them." He nodded slowly. "And the Empress's bondmate's consciousness, Vel Koran's consciousness, it's not in me. It's fragments, data." "The most accurate analogy would be a library," Vel said carefully. "You carry the books. They're not speaking to you." He thought about this. Is she going to want access to the library? Vel's expression moved through something that was professionally calibrated to neutrality but didn't quite make it. "That's a conversation beyond my expertise," she said. After she left, Darian sat in the review chamber alone for 10 minutes. He was doing the thing he did when situations exceeded their category, sitting at a horizontal surface, running the information through in the methodical order that produced the most accurate understanding, and resisting the entirely human impulse to reach a conclusion before the data was fully organized. He had been a diplomat for 11 years. He had been in rooms where the future of trade agreements, territorial rights, and bilateral relationships had hinged on what he said. Next, he had never been in a room or a genome where the stakes were quite so specifically personal for someone who was not him. He went to find the Empress. She was in the Imperial Observatory, which her staff told him with the specific neutrality of people communicating that this was significant without confirming why. The observatory occupied the highest point of Vel Antha-Sora, a pressurized dome of transparent composite through which the sector's stars were visible in the cold clarity of altitude above the atmosphere. And it was, he understood when he entered it and saw the quality of the silence, a room that had been private for a very long time. She was standing at the primary viewing aperture. She did not turn when he came in, which he took to mean she had been informed he was coming and had decided not to make an event of it. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the aperture, because the view required standing at it, and because standing beside someone was the least presumptuous spatial option available. The sector spread below and around them. Stars in numbers that resisted individual attention, the great arm of the galaxy doing what it always did, continuing, indifferently, beautifully, in complete disregard for what was happening in the observatory above one of its older civilizations. Sierra Vel gave you the report, Vel Antha-Sora said. She did, he said, and he looked at the stars for a moment. I want to say something clearly, he said, because I think clarity is more useful than either of us performing around it. Go ahead, she said. I'm not him, Darian said. I know you know that. I know you said it last night. But I want to say it from my side too, because I think it needs to exist in the record between us as something I've said and not just something you've acknowledged. I'm a human diplomat from a colonial moon who reads trade briefs and sits on floors when situations exceed my control. I carry something in my genome that I had no knowledge of and didn't ask for, and whatever it means for your science and your history, it doesn't change what I actually am. She turned to look at him. Her chromatic skin was the neutral silver of long habit, but at the edges, the fine skin near her temples, the inner line of her wrists, there was the fractional warmth he had seen the previous night. I know, she said, but I'm also not going to pretend, he said, that none of this matters, because it clearly does, and I'd rather be honest about what matters than diplomatic about it. You'd rather be honest than diplomatic, she said. You're an envoy. I contain multitudes, he said. Something happened in her expression that he was fairly certain had not happened in front of an audience in a very long time. It was not a smile exactly. It was the precursor to one, the moment before composure decided whether to hold or yield. You're not what I was prepared for, she said. I understand I'm not what any of the previous 31 envoys were either, he said. Though presumably for different reasons. Significantly different reasons, she agreed. They stood at the aperture while the stars continued their indifferent continuation outside it, and the observatory's long silence settled back around them in the way that silences settled in rooms that were accustomed to holding difficult things. Darian was aware, in the way he was aware of important information arriving, that he was standing in a place that had held grief for 200 years, and that the person beside him had done most of her grieving in it alone, and that whatever he was in relation to that grief signal carrier, scientific anomaly, accidental repository of something ancient and specific. He was also, actually and simply, himself. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask, she said. The 3 months you spent here after Vel Corin died, he said. After the transfer failed, what did you do in here? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then I talked, she said, to the absence, which is not a rational activity for an empress. It's a very rational activity for a person, he said. She looked at him. Her secondary eyes, the amber pair above the primary, were doing something he didn't have the species knowledge to fully interpret, but understood in the way you understood tone before you understood language. 200 years, she said, and then a genetic screening. And then a genetic screening, he agreed. I'm sorry that it was a shock. I have not been shocked in a very long time, she said. I know, he said. I was in the room. The fractional warmth at her temples and wrists deepened, briefly, in a register that even his complete lack of Cathori chromatic literacy could read as something. She looked back at the stars. He looked at the stars beside her. The observatory held them in its long-practiced silence, above the amber lights of Vel Antha-Sora, above the geometric precision of the imperial court, above 2 centuries of a wound that had organized itself efficiently into governance, and had spent this morning discovering that efficiency and closure were different things. The trade negotiations, she said eventually, And the way she said it, with the very slight softening of someone trying out a new register, suggested that she was not only talking about the trade negotiations. "Can proceed at whatever pace is appropriate," he said. "I'm in no hurry." She turned to look at him one more time, and this time she held it, a long, direct look in the clear observatory light, the kind of look that 3 centuries of composure could not fully contain, because it was not performing anything. It was simply looking. "You are nothing like him," she said. "No," he said, "and yet." "And yet," he agreed. Outside the dome, the sector continued its vast, indifferent turning, carrying with it the light of stars that had been burning before either of their civilizations had learned to name them, and the distance between impossibility and reality closed, as it sometimes did when no one was forcing it, to the width of 2 people standing in the same place and choosing to stay.